A wonderful good morning to you folks. Let me tell you, I'm really fired up about this week's episode. I hope you are following me on social media where I began teasing this show last week. Today's guest is no stranger to taking a stand in the arena, both in defense of the Constitution as well as in honoring his oath to the Constitution. His story is quite inspiring if you would like to look him up on the internet. First, I have to thank a few people for making this happen. A prior guest of the show and the Tennessee State Director of Citizens for Renewing America, Mrs. Andrea Gomez, put me in touch with some members of our guest team, a Miss Molly and a Miss Rachel. They were the primary movers in getting this interview scheduled, which was no small feat, especially given the national prominence of our guest and the demands on his time, coupled with the schedule I must meet while I'm serving my client down here in the Permian Basin. But it all worked out, and I am both humbled and honored to have Mr. Steve Friend on this week's episode of the podcast. Steve, like I said, is no stranger to the tyrannical overreach of the central government in Washington, D.C. It was his constitutionally steadfast actions as an agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation in standing up to their tyranny that led him to becoming a whistleblower of the SBI's corrupt practices that led him to being let go from the United States modern version of the Stasi. He put his livelihood and career on the line. I hope many of his former colleagues will follow his example of fealty to the Constitution in the coming months and years. I know that may be a pipe dream, but I have to hope for many more Steves to show themselves in the future so we, the people, can rein in what used to be a highly respected part of the central government. But it has become now the enforcement agency of the communist agenda. There are not any breaks built into this episode, so stand by for 30 or so minutes of constitutional facts and recommended actions coming from a warrior that stood in the gap between an out-of-control central government and us, we the people, the citizens of these United States of America. Before we start the show, though, here comes the disclaimer. The following content is approved by Larry Linton for TN12, candidate for the GOP nomination for Tennessee House of Representatives, District 12. Larry Linton, Treasurer. With the disclaimer out of the way, please join me as I welcome in Mr. Steve Friend on this week's episode of the Liberty, Leadership, and Lives podcast. Steve, welcome to the program. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, absolutely. It's my pleasure. It's always wonderful to have a defender of liberty come on the show and talk about their work. So why don't you go ahead and give the audience a brief background on what happened and what you're doing now to follow your oath, more importantly, but to protect the liberty of the citizens of this state and this country.
Well, I worked in law enforcement for about a decade and a half. I was a police officer in Georgia for a number of years, and then ultimately applied to and was accepted by the FBI in 2014. First 7 years in the Bureau, was assigned to the Midwest and was investigating violent crimes on Indian reservations. Opened about 200 cases while I was out there, arrested 150 violent criminals, was a member of the SWAT team.
Wow.
Then relocated in 2021 to Florida, where I live now, and was transferred with the understanding I was going to work on child pornography, human trafficking, child exploitation cases. But after arriving a few months later, officially was transferred to work on the Joint Terrorism Task Force as a domestic terrorism specialized agent. And that was the first time I actually got a chance to look at the January 6 cases that the FBI is mishandling. And it was really apparent from my experience, my training, that they are departing from the rules. So I brought forward concerns about that, as well as my concerns that they were being overly aggressive to arrest particular subjects. So in my office, they were sending a SWAT team to go and arrest an individual who said he would cooperate fully when he was interviewed, and he'd been interviewed a year and a half prior. So 18 months had elapsed without contact from the FBI. And I thought that was a unnecessary risk to his safety, to our safety. It was really like a Ruby Ridge sort of setup. So brought that to the attention of my superiors, and they facilitated my suspension indefinitely, unpaid suspension from duty within 30 days of me coming forward.
Wow. So you following your oath and following the actual law and following certain protocols resulted in the FBI suspending you. So give us a little brief your thoughts on Do you think the Department of Justice and more specifically the FBI has been weaponized against the citizens of this country?
Yes, without question, the FBI is weaponized, and there you could question the motivations behind it. And I think there are several of them. But from what we see on a day-to-day basis, is there's a reason that approval is through the floor on the FBI, and I think we're all just have eyes to see and ears to hear. Now, as
Mm,
far as the motivations behind that, I think a lot of it's tied to one thing called integrated program management,
okay.
which is a quota system for the FBI, and that it perversely incentivizes what goes on in law enforcement. The goal of law enforcement should be to bring crime down, but the
Right.
FBI is incentivized to bring the numbers up so that they can go to Congress and say, you give us 11 billion, why don't you give us 12? Look at all the good work we're doing. And our elected officials really don't read the fine print on most of the work the FBI claims to do. They don't really do much work. They just kind of take and adopt local cases, and senior executives get bonuses because of it. So I think there's a structural problem there. I think there's also a political capture at the very top end of the pyramid, and the very bottom end it's very broad, so they're able to compartmentalize responsibilities, and people are compromised. Even at the bottom, they're financially compromised. They say, look, I know I'm part of a system that's broken, but I got bills to pay, I got a mortgage, got kids, and I'm just going to just follow orders. And that is an insufficient response from my standpoint, because if you're in a position of public trust and you swear an oath to protect the Constitution, then you should not be operating in bad faith like that. There's a higher expectation of you. And then last, I think that there's an evolution that we're seeing, that the FBI is broadly interpreting its national security mandate as it as wants to fulfill its quota system and also do the political bidding of those who are in charge. So the transition happens really early on in the early 2000s. They
Mm,
stopped fighting actual terrorists and they started going after what they called homegrown violent extremists. And those were typically vulnerable Muslims who the FBI essentially had trapped into these plots. And then they used that playbook against the next evolution, which was the domestic violent extremists, as President Biden labeled them, MAGA Republicans, white supremacists, militia violent extremists, parents at school board meetings.
mm,
And now the latest is the anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremist, agave. And that's someone who just has a perception of government overreach or negligence. So pretty broad. And the FBI is going to use all of its tools at its disposal and reinterpret what people do to get around certain protections that are supposed to be in our system, like a caveat that the FBI doesn't investigate First Amendment protected activity
mm.
because you go to a church, that doesn't make you the subject of a terrorist investigation. But if the FBI can articulate that going to church makes you a white supremacist, as they are currently doing and as they've been doing the last few years, well, now they can say that you're a domestic terrorist. And they try to do that with the radical traditional Catholic
Mm.
intelligence report. And now they're doing it with the Christian nationalist narrative.
That it's becoming, I think to me, it looks like it's becoming a self-licking ice cream cone, is what I like to call it, where a government or any entity within the government will classify something one way and then it just keeps building and building upon that. So it always has this endless cycle of whatever they need, like victims, they'll need victims or they'll need suspects. So it's a self-licking ice cream cone to, like you said, there's a quota system, right? So if they categorize more and more stuff as investigatory eligible, of course they're gonna get that, right? They're gonna get that with that quota system.
They will, and the fact that they're not really into law enforcement anymore, they're into intelligence collection, and they will tell you that it's an intelligence agency.
Mm,
But there's also a problem because it's a square peg in a round hole when it comes to that, because law enforcement is very linear, where you have a crime happen and then you determine who did that crime and investigate it, and then you present the facts and it goes to court and case closed, right? No matter what the outcome is. But in intelligence, you don't need a crime, you need a person. You have the person, you don't have to respect civil rights or due process, because the expectation is an intelligence investigation is never actually going to go to court. So we
mm,
can violate those little inconveniences. And we have that person so we can learn about them. It's very circular. You just keep learning and learning and learning. And it sets up a situation where you have your man and you can find a crime if you want to do that, which is what we saw with someone like General Mike Flynn, where he
right.
was part of a Russia collusion intelligence investigation. And then Bill Priestep, who was in charge of counterintelligence at the FBI, he was the assistant director. He was fully aware that they were sending agents in there and wrote down in the case file, our hope is to get him to lie so that we can get him fired or charged with a crime.
Right. So yeah, so they find a person and then find the crime, or invent a crime, so to speak. Sometimes it's just
Yes,
terrible.
they reinterpret the law if they don't even have the crime, which is what you get with the 1512 charge with a lot of these January 6th defendants, which is obstruction of an official proceeding. Well, that's a tax law.
Right.
It's affiliated with Enron, but the Department of Justice and the FBI broadly interpreted that and used it as a felony to get felony charges on people who really didn't do anything other than walk through the Capitol. And you can debate whether or not it was a restricted area or if there was some sort of riot and that they were disobeying police officers, what have you. There's a reason that most of those people were then charged with this 4-pack of misdemeanors, and they come at them with the threat and the hammer of a felony charge, and most people can't withstand that. And I can't blame them. They're going into a star chamber there. They have no chance. There's no due process.
Right. So I know that 1512 is being considered in the sentencing right now up at the appellate level, isn't it, or is it at the Supreme Court already?
Supreme Court already has it.
Oh, okay.
They're going to hear arguments on it next month.
Oh, that's so maybe that may maybe lessen the blow of the hammer on these guys, or maybe force the reconsideration of some of these sentences.
Well, the process is the punishment.
Mm.
So what will happen is if those are overturned, there will be some superseding indictments, I'm sure, because the DOJ has a couple of different felonies that they will then charge instead.
Just
There's no escaping this. The only escape is going to be presidential pardons or a statute of limitations on January 6th, 2026.
oh, it's just terrible. So I noticed you retweeted a bill that the Tennessee Senate is considering right now about how we can lessen the participation of state and federal law enforcement entities. Can you go into a little bit about that? Because this is a Tennessee focused podcast, so I'd like to stay kind of in that lane. And I appreciate you all the visits you've been doing in Tennessee and excuse me, coming on some of those podcasts. I listened to the entire one you did with Gary Humble of Tennessee Stands. That was phenomenal. I was like, hey, let me talk to him. But yeah, can you go ahead and elaborate a little bit on that Tennessee bill for the folks here in the Tennessee audience?
Well, the particular portion that I'm involved with is House Bill 2912 and Senate Bill 2804. It's right now in subcommittee, criminal justice subcommittees. And I'm actually going to testify in front of those next week. And it essentially would be a ban. It would ban state certified peace officers, law enforcement officers, police officers, deputies from being members of an FBI joint terrorism task force as a task force officer. Now, why does that matter? I'll tell you what it doesn't do. It doesn't stop you from being on a different task force with the FBI that's focused on criminal matters, like a Safe Streets task force that looks at gangs, or a trans organized crime task force that looks at drugs, violent crime, any of that. And it doesn't stop you from sharing information with the FBI, even as it pertains to national security and to terrorism. It doesn't stop them from sharing it with you. It doesn't stop you from being in a fusion center, which is a Department of Homeland Security brain trust. It doesn't even stop the FBI from working with local law enforcement on terrorism cases. Here's the hangup, though. When you are a task force officer, so if you're a deputy working for an agency and you are nominated to go and work for the FBI as a task force officer on a joint terrorism task force, a JTTF, you walk in the door and you get a security clearance. So you have to have a need to know. And you work on the cases that the FBI wants you to work on, and you can't even tell your sheriff about it because he doesn't have the same clearance. He doesn't have a need to know. So essentially, you are co-opted by the FBI to go after what their priorities are. If we deprive the FBI of that manpower, but not of the ability to work with local partners, they would have to bring a legitimate terrorism case to a sheriff who's the chief law enforcement executive within a county, elected and answerable to the people, whereas the FBI is not. And they would say, look, we have this investigation going on in this particular terrorist subject. We would like to work with you and work with some of your people on it. We could use the help. And the sheriff could be yay or nay on that. And I think that is what we want. We want to empower the local law enforcement officers to make that call, and it would actually bring the FBI back into line, because they're not going to bring them the garbage domestic terrorist investigation of a mom at a school board meeting, because that sheriff's not only going to say no, he's probably going to expose it. So we're going to actually get back to what we should really be focusing on from a national security perspective, and that's going after people who want to subject Americans to fraud and force and use their ideology as a basis for that.
Yeah, I'm all in for that. I mean, we have to get back to where the states, you know, a lot of the bases, because I don't know if anybody's told you, I am also running for office here in Tennessee. I'm running for the state House of Representatives in this election cycle. We have to get back to the point where the states start asserting their sovereignty over the federal government and leave the federal government's enumerated powers, force them to stay within their constitutional bounds. So, and something like that, where it's what's currently in place, is where they can circumvent the local chain of command by keeping the sheriff out of the business of their deputies. That's federal intrusion, I believe. I mean, it's usurping the authority of that sheriff in that county or that police chief in that city.
And it's a tough pill to swallow. I think there's going to be resistance on this from one particular aspect. That's the financial angle. The
Mhm.
federal government comes in and gives you golden handcuffs. They say, if you give us your people, we're going to pay their overtime. We're going to give them training and equipment, because Uncle Sam can just keep printing money, right? And it doesn't
Right.
matter to them. And the states and the localities, really, that's a lot of money.
Right.
But to me, the response to that is, if you are in a position of public trust, be it as a state rep who's going to be voting on this amendment, or a Tennessee Bureau of Investigations that I've gotten some pushback from them on this, or even just a sheriff, you've sworn an oath, you're in a position of public trust, and you have to be able to answer the question that you are willing to allow a certain number of Tennesseans to be the victims of FBI weaponization and abuse, so that Uncle Sam will pay your overtime. And when you say it that way, I think that's a betrayal of your oath, and you be derelict in your duty to accept any number above zero.
Absolutely. I mean, the federal government has gotten so used to being able to bribe the states and citizens within the states with their own money. I mean, where do they get the money that they can bribe states with? Well, from the citizens of the states to begin with. It's a it's a whole different argument for the 16th Amendment, how it's an aberration. But anyway, so I follow you work, and I see what I cheer you on for, because you're one of the people that I see that has taken a stand in the arena for liberty and defense of the constitutional founding of our government and our way of life here. But tell me, do you think you're having an impact?
I think the jury's out. I think at a federal level, I've sort of given up on that. There's not a savior in Washington, D.C. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. People ask me all the time, because I testified almost a year ago now in front of the weaponization committee under the House Judiciary, and they say, "What do you think of them?" And I'll say, "Well, I'm going to hold back my judgment until I see them do something, and then I'll give you my assessment of that." That just seems to be sound and fury signifying nothing, so that we can get our 3-minute clip to get on TV, on cable news, and then maybe fundraise, and then maybe run for reelection on that. There's no appetite for that. The House passed and funded the FBI
A new
through
building too,
the
right?
through
A
the
whole
fiscal
brand new
year,
building.
and they voted last year over $300 million for new FBI headquarters. And so the idea that those guys are going to do anything, I mean, they have basically made it clear that there is an acceptable level of abuse of the American people that they are willing to tolerate in return for not having to have a partial government shutdown, which
Right.
is to me a dereliction of their own oath of office. I think that doing something at a state level is probably the next route for me to go.
Mhm.
I've been able to raise some awareness and motivate some other people to do things like yourself, to run for office. I'm
Mhm.
trying to actually impact my local county and then develop relationships there. I've really just come around to the acceptance that it's going to be the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. It's the best route to go,
Mhm.
and I'm just hopefully trying to create these allyships with some people. And if Tennessee actually takes a stand on this particular amendment, this would be a shot across the bow. This would be sort of a precedent to set for other states to follow. And there are certainly a few of them out there that are pretty energetic and want to get on board. And I would be very excited if Tennessee were to pass this, because I would be hopeful that then Florida would follow suit, and maybe Texas and Iowa. I've had some interest from Idaho, so I want to get a few of them out there and really get a coalition of states so that we can try to seize back some of the power from the feds.
Absolutely, and it's going to take the state level. And you've echoed what I've been saying along. The federal government is lost. It's lost, and it will not be recovered until the states themselves start asserting their sovereignty. You said doctrine of lesser magistrate, but in all reality, the states are the major magistrate when it comes to the federal government, but they've just allowed themselves to be treated like a lesser magistrate through, the taxation and funding and federal money and all that. They rolled over and showed their soft underbelly to a government that's out of control, operates outside its enumerated powers, uses its citizens' money against not only the citizens in the states, but uses it to prop up their own power bases in foreign countries, like we're witnessing, I believe, with Ukraine right now.
Well, the states are really a reflection of the people.
Right.
And the people continue to not show up in primaries and to be completely uninvolved and just outsource their citizenship. I'm sorry, but saying that you go to the polls every 2, 4, or 6 years doesn't make you a good citizen. As much Fox News as you watch, you're no different than the person who watches Entertainment Tonight. You're not making really any impact whatsoever. You're just imbibing that content as infotainment rather than information, and then doing whatever the host tells you to do. Being American, it requires more than that. It requires more than just voting every couple of years. It's not a leisure pursuit. You have to do more than that. That's the way this country was set up. But unfortunately, this country's success has bred the idea that it is a leisure pursuit. And as long as you have Netflix and Uber Eats, you really don't have to go to a school board meeting. People are unwilling to be uncomfortable or inconvenienced. And the communists on the other side of the Cold Civil War that we are currently engaged in, and we are engaged in one,
Yes, we are.
we just want to get along. They want to win. And that's an asymmetrical battle that's impossible to win. We just can't seem to shake the folks hard enough. They're not quite uncomfortable enough yet to engage. And the hourglass, the sand is running out there.
Absolutely. I listened to another host. I think you've been on with Dan Bongino before, right?
Yes.
So he says it all the time. Is it bad enough yet? And it's not. It's not near bad enough yet until it gets bad enough. I mean, that's what I hope to do with my election, is to stave off, because when it gets bad enough, it's going to get really bad. It's going to be something that this country hasn't seen since the 1860s. And I think we all, as a true believers in our constitutional republic, need to do everything we can to prevent that. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt talked about citizenship in a republic. It's a daily responsibility for us to be involved in our own system of self-governance, or we lose the republic. We lose the very government that we put into place to secure our liberty is now going to rob us of our liberty, every single one of them.
I have a podcast with other FBI whistleblower, Garrett O'Boyle, the American Radicals podcast. And in the last 5 Saturdays, we've done a book study on Animal Farm. And I hadn't gone back and read Animal Farm for 20 years. You read
about
it
40
once
for
and
me.
it has that impact. And you think, oh, I remember the story. And actually going through the exercise of reading the story, when you know what's going to happen ultimately, I think that one of the biggest takeaways that I had, and it sort of goes to what you're talking about, how bad things can get, chapter to chapter, the way George Orwell did that book, it was not incrementally getting worse. It was a upward curve to that. It was, we turned the temperature on the boiling pot up 1 degree, and then we turn it up by 2 degrees. And the next chapter, we turn it up by 4 degrees. And the next chapter, we turn it up by 8 degrees. It was incrementally getting worse significantly from chapter to chapter. And I think that's indicative of the path that we're on. And the next chapter will be substantially worse than the one we're currently on. Then the question is, do we have enough? Does Gideon's army have its 300 yet? I don't think so. I think too many people just think they can vote their way out of this. And we got to vote for the GOP that just funded the FBI. We got to vote for the GOP that gave us the 3 Supreme Court justices that just betrayed us on the border. The answer is not in other people at a faraway distant capital. The answer is you taking care of what you can almost like a bullseye. You have a certain amount of ammunition in your gun. You use everything you can to hit that 10 ring. If you have a little bit more afterwards, then you expand out to the 9 ring. If you have a little bit more, then you expand out to the 8 ring. The 10 ring is, I'm going to take care of my house. I'm going to indoctrinate my kids to make sure that they know what right is right and wrong is wrong. There's no your truth or my truth. There's just the truth. And the truth is there's just men and women. There's not 87 different genders. I'm going to handle that. And then I'm going to go to my school board. I'm going to read books to make sure that the smut is taken down off the shelves, even though my kids don't even attend public school. It's important because I would like for my boys to marry a woman someday, and I would like for her very not much not to be a vile, godless Marxist communist who went to the public schools. So I'm going to contribute there. And then I'm going to get to know my county board of commissioners and the chair of my county and find out what's plaguing our community there. And after that, I'm going to draft legislation and take it up to my state house. Now, look, I'm hyper involved at this point, but I definitely think that there's a roadmap for someone to take up one thing.
Right.
Why don't you give up filling out your bracket tonight and go to the school board? Have that be the one thing that you do.
Just one thing, and it starts with that. It does. That's absolutely. Once they start with it, because most Americans, I think, because we've lived in such a comfortable society for such a long time now, the apathy is what I call it. The apathy of the electorate is set in, and most of these people, you see, well, it doesn't affect me what's going on. I just want government to leave me alone. But little do they realize, if you look around the room right now, around yourself, I can look around this hotel room that I'm staying in Midland, Texas right now from work. There's not one bit of material in here that the federal government is not involved in. Not one bit. I mean, I'm getting taxed just for sitting here and breathing. We're getting taxed, or we're paying some kind of governmental oversight so they can regulate the desk that my laptop is on, or regulate the laptop itself and the power company that powers it, or the Wi-Fi. Government has intruded into every aspect of our lives, contrary to what the founding fathers wanted. They wanted a very small central government to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. That was the design of the federal government. And yet we've got to this point now where most Americans just I don't even need to vote. I don't even need to participate. As long as they're not busting down my door, I don't care. But they've already bust down the door. They're in everybody's living room. They're in everybody's kitchen. They're in everybody's bedroom.
Especially when it comes to the digital aspect to this. And I've written about this. I've talked about it. Everybody talks about their First Amendment right to speak, and we got to have the second so we can protect the first. And you better not violate my Fourth Amendment with Section 702 which they do all the time. And if I get in trouble, I'm going to plead the Fifth. And we're violating our Sixth Amendment rights when we're not getting a fair trial by jury. And we always skip over number 3. Quartering of soldiers is actually happening right now digitally because of the liaison public-private partnerships that happen between entities like the FBI and these social media companies. They will get their hooks into them and do things like Operation Bronze Griffin, where Operation Bronze Griffin is a confidential source who works for Facebook and goes into your private messages and gives them to the FBI without your consent, without a search warrant, without a subpoena. Now, how is that quartering soldiers? Well, you put your phone by your bed at night, don't you? What was the purpose of quartering of soldiers? Well, it was to gain intelligence, and it was to suppress communication between people. Well, they're gaining intelligence on all of us and sharing it willfully with our government. And then they're suppressing speech because people say, I probably shouldn't say what I want to say now on my Twitter account because I don't want to get in the crosshairs of a domestic terrorism investigation from the FBI. It's accomplishing both things. We are quartering digital soldiers in our house.
Absolutely. And that's why this CBDC is just a terrible way to go, because that's what the government wants, right? They've already got first cut of your money, your sweat equity, your freedom. They get the first cut through their income tax. And then they're going to force this with the CBDCs to not only know what you buy, but control what you buy and how much you spend and track you. That's another quartering of soldiers in your wallet once that gets into place.
And they will attempt to compel people to do so, to actually enter it, because people don't do even a small amount of critical thinking, you can imagine that there's going to be some sort of Fed coin that's proffered, and they will say, hey, for every $1 that you give us, we'll give you 10 Fed coins. And people will think, wow, I'm just going to be 10x richer than I am right now. It's a little bit like the way we're seeing the hyperinflation. I mean, pretty much we're all going to be trillionaires at the rate that the Congress is spending right now.
Absolutely. So you're a resident of Florida and you're working there primarily with that legislature, but I see that you worked with Tennessee's, and I'm really thankful for that. What do you see going forward down there in Florida?
Florida is going to be one of the shining lights, I think. We've had a lot of really active areas and people that are embracing their citizenship. I was just about a week and a half ago down in Collier County, which is a home of Naples, pretty well off area. You think it would be pretty easy for them to just check out and coast into their golden years. No, they went and tried to pass a Bill of Rights sanctuary county ordinance, failed, and then worked for 2 years to elect two different county board of commissioners, won, and then passed it 4-1. So now that county is going to have a sheriff who stands in the gap, so that if the federal government comes down and says you have to shut down your non-essential business that you use to feed your family and pay your mortgage, they're going to say, no, we're not down to clown. If you try to enforce that, then we'll arrest you. So Florida has that sort of edge to it. We need to make Texas the way that Texas thinks that it is. That's
Right.
what Florida is right now. So I'm optimistic. I'm a fan of our governor. I think that he's done a great job, and he's one of the main reasons that I did wind up trying to transfer here versus other states.
Right.
And hopefully that the queue behind him, because he's term limited, are people who are going to share that sentiment of being energetic and actually serving the people, and wanting to just wake up every day and slay shibboleths of the communist left, rather than just be saying poll tested lines and trying to get to your next reelection.
Yeah, as Governor DeSantis, I think he is a rock star. I mean, it wasn't his time this year, but I think he is a good torchbearer. He's providing a good example of what a sovereign state can do against, with withstanding the federal government's pressure. So I just wish more governors were like that. I have a huge beef with Tennessee Governor Bill Lee. I think he's one of those ones that I call a trans-publican. He identifies as a Republican just to get reelected in a red state, or elected the first time without any proper vetting. And this is what we got in Tennessee. Now we got his bootlickers in our General Assembly that do his bidding, and it's a mirage. It's a facade of liberty in the state of Tennessee. It's a facade, and we got a lot of people working to maintain that facade. And I wish we would do a lot more things like Florida. We got some good people in a General Assembly, but I mean, of the 99 plus, 99 representatives, we probably only got like 8 true constitutional conservative representatives up there. And so when 8 are going against 91, we get what we get.
It sounds like better odds than Thomas Massey has at the U.S. House.
Yeah.
I think he's probably the only one these days. Well, maybe Chip Roy, but 2 against 433 is really not
Right.
the odds are not in your favor. It's very Hunger Games.
Right. I wish we could clone Thomas Massey. He is he's amazing. And Rand Paul. So what in Kentucky? I don't know how Kentucky ended up with Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul, but good thing that Mitch McConnell's on his way out. So that's good. Well, Steve, I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and chatting with us here. And hopefully next time you come into Tennessee, you got a place to stay in Sevierville. If you want to see the Smoky Mountains, I got a perfect view right off my back porch every morning when I'm home. But thanks for coming on the program. If you got any closing words for the audience, we sure appreciate to hear them.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Just get in your rep's ear. House bill is 2912, Senate bill 2804. I don't even live in the state, but I see that the impact that can have, and make sure that you know that what the details are that I've kind of laid out here, and know that this will actually empower the state and the sheriffs who you elect to actually be the chief law enforcement officer and be accountable to you. So get in their ear and encourage them to support this. This is a way that actually Tennessee can take the lead here in the country, as a conservative state that I know that you hope that it eventually becomes.
All right. Well, once again, Steve, thanks. Appreciate coming on, and Anytime you want to chat, just shoot me an email or I'll keep in touch with your team and see if we can get you on again in the future.
Thank you. God bless.
Thanks. Well, folks, that is all the time I have this week. I hope you enjoyed the interview with a constitutional warrior that, like I said, stood in the gap to expose the tyranny happening at the federal level. As I mentioned in the interview, I hope to have Mr. Friend on the podcast again in the future. In the meantime, if you live here in Tennessee, please contact your state representative and state senator and urge them to support the passage of House Bill 2912 and Senate Bill 2804. It is imperative that the people of Tennessee start to push back on the central government overreach that many times occurs under the auspices of the corrupt Federal Bureau of Investigation. Please remember to subscribe to the show on Rumble and YouTube. Don't forget to select the notifications link. That way, when I come out with material in between shows, you'll be able to stay up to date with this podcast, as well as matters that pertain to the campaign. I again want to thank each and every one of you for joining me this week and every week. Today's wisdom from God's word comes to us from Isaiah chapter 1, verse 4. Woe to the sinful nation, a people whose guilt is great, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord. They have spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him. All of us citizens, both here in Tennessee and across the Republic, can look to the example of this week's guest as a person that exposed the corruption and evildoers that serve not our Constitution and their oaths, but serve to obtain and maintain power for power's sake. The people that occupy positions of power in the central government, and yes, here even in our state government, have not only forsaken the Lord, they have forsaken their oaths. We need many more people like Mr. Steve Friend so that we can be shown the evil they are perpetuating on the people and we could stand up with them and expose them as well. Only then can we save our state and save our nation. There's only a small window of opportunity to do this, folks. And like I said in the interview, it has to start at the state level. If the people of my House District, House District 12, continue to do the same things they have been doing in the past, which is supporting and electing establishment candidates, they can count on not getting any different results. Just look to the example set in Washington, D.C. this past week. The establishment candidates continue to sell out the citizens of their own country for their personal benefit. Sending a candidate to Nashville cut from the same mold as those people in Washington, D.C. will only hasten Tennessee's demise. The residents of Sevier County can vote for the true constitutional Republican this August who will honor the oath and stand in the gap between the government and the people. You know who that is. Until next week, I humbly pray and ask that you stand in the arena with me. Reveille, it's time to wake up.